Well, hello to you all. Welcome to another one of my presentations for One Day University. This is actually my second presentation on the site so far. My name is Dr. Spencer Jones. I'm a senior lecturer in Armed Forces and War Studies at the University of Wolverhampton in the United Kingdom. Today's talk explores, of course, the First World War and the Undersea War element of this conflict. When we think about submarine warfare, we almost invariably think of the submarine warfare in the Battle of the Atlantic in the Second World War. But we often forget that there was an equally bitter and indeed equally dangerous submarine conflict between the years of 1914 and 1918, and one that would have profound international ramifications, not only for Britain, which of course was facing this onslaught, but also for the United States, which would find its neutrality sorely tested by German undersea provocations. And in the course of this lecture, I'm going to explore all of these elements and ultimately examine how the U-boat menace was defeated in the First World War. To begin, let's consider the nature of U-boats in 1914. Submarines themselves as a concept were not new in 1914, but as an operating system that actually functioned properly, they certainly were. The German Navy had only commissioned its first functioning U-boat in December 1906. Previous attempts to create submarines had largely been unsuccessful in Germany. By 1914, the German Navy possessed three basic types of U-boat. U-boat, of course, simply stands for undersea boat, a name given to submarines to differentiate them from torpedo boats, which were their rather similar surface-moving cousins. U-boats came in three basic varieties in the German Navy of 1914. The first were U-boats, the larger of the classes, about 200 feet long, with a complement of around about 50 men, carrying torpedo tubes and with a deck gun mounted at the front of the U-boat, which could be used to engage surface targets. There were also two smaller types of U-boat, the UB class, which was a coastal patrol boat, really used for coastal defense to protect Germany's ports, and the U-boat that you can see in the image I'm showing now, which is a UC boat, which is a very small mine-laying class of coastal U-boat designed to lay minefields to prevent Allied shipping approaching German ports. The U-class and the UB and UC class all had the same basic principles. They were fast on the surface using diesel engines and getting up to a speed of perhaps 15 knots at top speed. And they could also operate submerged using their electric batteries. The electric batteries would only run underwater and they would need to be recharged by running the diesel engines on the surface. Underwater U-boats were slow and rather difficult to handle. Their underwater speed, perhaps a maximum of 5 knots in favorable conditions. And their undersea endurance, relatively brief, 12 hours maximum, and anything beyond that would start to risk asphyxiating the crew. Maneuverability underwater was also very poor, and indeed submarines would only operate at relatively shallow depths at this stage of the war. The maximum test depth for U-boats was about 150 feet, much shallower than in the Second World War, although U-boats did frequently exceed this test depth, and it was found that U-boats operating as deep as 300 feet could still function. The principle of a U-boat was not so much to attack from underwater, though it had that ability, but instead to use its relatively high speed and its very low profile, it was difficult to spot when operating on the surface, to outmaneuver its targets. It was faster than all but the fastest warships of this period, get into position, and then perhaps submerge where it could launch a hidden torpedo attack. And against weaker vessels, and indeed merchant vessels, it may not submerge at all. Instead, it could surface and engage them with its deck gun, its deck armament, which of course, although a single gun, was a powerful high caliber weapon and more than a match for a merchantman. But I'm talking about destruction of merchant ships, which was not a concept that was widely considered in the German Navy in 1914. Indeed, there had been just a single pre-war study by a junior captain in the German Navy who had speculated that Britain, of course an island dependent on maritime trade, could be starved into submission by a U-boat campaign, but that it would take at least 200 U-boats to ensure that blockade. And this captain himself may have in fact been inspired by an Arthur Conan Doyle story that was published around about the same time in the summer of 1914 called England's Peril in the Strand magazine, of course the home of Sherlock Holmes, and Conan Doyle the author of Sherlock Holmes. And in England's Peril, Conan Doyle speculated that Britain might be starved to death by an unnamed but clearly German continental power using submarines, and perhaps this inspired the German Navy's study. But at the outbreak of the war, the German Navy did not anticipate using submarines in this fashion. Instead, they intended to use them as an adjunct to the fleet, using them as scouts and using them as ambushers to attack Royal Navy warships rather than merchantmen. And indeed, in this role, spectacular successes could be achieved. Perhaps the most famous of these in the early part of the war was the Broad 14's disaster on the 22nd of September 1914. Broad 14's, an area of the North Sea, was being patrolled by 3 obsolete British cruisers. They were really in a poor position, they weren't being well commanded by their skippers, and they were ambushed by a single U-boat, which sank all 3 of them, with the loss of over 1,400 Royal Naval personnel, making it the highest loss of Royal Naval personnel, the second highest loss of Royal Naval personnel in the entire First World War, second only to the disastrous casualties at the Battle of Jutland. This shocking example of how powerful U-boats could be sent a spasm of fear through the Royal Navy, and it also highlighted to the Germans just what might be achieved if the U-boats were deployed properly. But that deployment question was one that was vexing the German Navy just a few months after it had achieved this striking success at Broad 14's. The issue was how to employ U-boats within the bounds of maritime law. Maritime law in 1914 had been codified by the Declaration of London in 1909, which was a series of agreements about how commerce warfare might be carried out in the First World War. Significantly, neither Britain nor the United States had signed the Declaration of London, but Germany had. And part of the Declaration of London said that in future conflict, economic blockades would be carried out under so-called cruiser rules. The idea of cruiser rules was that a cruiser, or indeed any other vessel intercepting a merchantman, would make that merchantman stop. They would then summon the skipper or an officer to them, who would bring documentation proving what the ship was carrying. If it was found to be carrying contraband or material that was going to be useful for an enemy to make war, then the stopping ship, the cruiser, or indeed the U-boat, could then send the crew back, tell them that they had a certain amount of time to abandon ship, and then they would sink the vessel. In the U-boat's case, almost always using their deck gun. It was more efficient, it was simpler, you saved torpedoes for the really big targets that you couldn't sink with your gun. And there's an image here, in fact, in 1915, of a U-boat doing just this. It stopped a merchantman on the right-hand side of the picture. It's pointing its gun. You can just see it. The U-boat's gun on the left-hand side is pointing the gun, just warning it there's going to be action, and it's waiting for the skipper or an officer to come across to show his cargo manifest. And if it was found to contain contraband, then the U-boat would be in its legal rights to destroy this merchant vessel. The problem with cruiser warfare was that it inevitably took away some advantages of the U-boat. It forced a U-boat to surface, it forced a U-boat to stop as well, because to carry out an inspection of the paperwork, it would be necessary to summon skippers across, or in some very rare cases, put a U-boat search party aboard a ship. And the U-boat was at its most vulnerable when it had stopped, of course. And so this posed certain risks and certain dangers. It was also felt that this took away some of the edge of the U-boats by stopping ships, by diminishing the surprise effect of being attacked from underwater, and indeed the terrorizing effect of that. The overall effectiveness of the U-boats was felt to be somewhat diminished. Nevertheless, the idea of using U-boats to attack commerce caught on in the latter part of 1914. It was informed by several factors. The first was that the British had imposed a very effective economic blockade of Germany that was cutting Germany off from world imports. Effectively, the British had closed the entrances and exits from the North Sea, across the Orkneys, to Scandinavia in the north, and across the English Channel to the south. That blockade will get tighter and tighter as the war grew on. The Germans were enraged by it and declared it a food blockade, a starvation blockade, which was illegal under the terms of the Declaration of London. Of course, Britain was not a signatory to that. Furthermore, by early 1915, the Germans were struggling strategically. They had based their entire war plan on a very short, victorious war, primarily, of course, against France in the West. And when that failed and trench warfare took over and deadlock settled in the West, they needed a new way to take the war to their enemies.